Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to today's event, Truth and Consequences, the Impact of Repealing Birthright Citizenship. I'm Caroline Fredrickson. I'm the Executive Director of the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy. ACS was founded in 2001, for those of you who are not familiar with our organization, and we are a leading progressive legal organization in a rapidly growing network of lawyers, law students, scholars, judges, policymakers, and individuals concerned about our Constitution. This year we are celebrating our 10th anniversary, and we hope you will join us this summer from June 16th through 18th at our convention to celebrate that milestone. ACS is delighted to co-host what is the second of two events that we have hosted with the Center for American Progress on birthright citizenship. The first, which we held in March, was an exploration of the historical and constitutional issues associated with birthright citizenship. And at that time, ACS published an issue brief by Elizabeth Wydra, who's the chief counsel of the Center for Constitutional Accountability. If you have not read Elizabeth's issue brief, I commend it to you, and it is available on the ACS website. Today's focus is the real-world implications of ending birthright citizenship, that is, the 14th Amendment's guarantee of automatic citizenship for all born on American soil. Recently, some state and federal lawmakers have proposed excluding certain children from this constitutional guarantee. In January, Senators Rand Paul of Kentucky and David Vitter of Louisiana introduced legislation that would amend the Constitution to restrict citizenship to those, and only those, who can demonstrate that one of their parents is a U.S. citizen, a legal immigrant, or an active member of the armed forces at their birth. And in March, the Arizona State Legislature rejected a measure that would exclude children born to undocumented immigrants from birthright citizenship. But similar initiatives are proliferating throughout the states, and House Judiciary Committee Chair Lamar Smith has stated that he intends to hold hearings. So this is obviously a very important issue, and we are very pleased to have such a formidable panel today to discuss what our nation would look like and what would be the impact on all Americans were the 14th Amendment's guarantee repealed. Today, the Center for American Progress has released a paper, Less Than Citizens: Abolishing Birthright Citizenship Would Create a Permanent Underclass in Our Nation, which is authored by one of our panelists today, Sam Fullwood, and CAP's Director of Immigration Policy, Marshall Fitz. That paper is available on CAP's website. So now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing today's moderator, who has been a close partner and a good friend in putting this series together with us at ACS. Angie Kelly's complete biography is in your materials, but I will hit a few of the very, very many highlights, which we obviously can't cover today because that would take up all the time for the panel. Angela Maria Kelly is the Vice President for Immigration Policy and Advocacy at CAP. Before joining the center in 2009, Angie served as Director of the Immigration Policy Center, which is the research arm of the American Immigration Law Foundation, which provides policymakers, academics, media, and the public with access to accurate information about the effects of immigration on the U.S. economy and society. And prior to that, Angie was the Deputy Director at the National Immigration Forum, where she headed its legislative, policy, and communications activities. We could not have a better moderator for today's panel, so please join me in welcoming Angie. Thank you.
You have to sit next to me. Doesn't matter the order. Great, everyone good? Our mics are on? Terrific. Thank you, Caroline, for such a lovely introduction. I was blushing. I appreciate it greatly. And I do have the honor and pleasure of working at the Center for American Progress as the Vice President on Immigration Policy and Advocacy, and getting to do a terrific event like this one with the panels, which I'll introduce in a moment. And doing it, for those of you who know CAP events and me, not panels where people are making formal presentations, but more Oprah style. You don't get a car, but you get to hang out with us and listen to what will be a kitchen table-like conversation with experts on the topic of birthright citizenship and what would happen if we were to abolish it. And then we'll open it up for questions that you all can ask us. So this is a multi-dimensional, it's like multi-dimensional chess, right? The questions of repealing birthright citizenship. So you've got legal and constitutional questions, which are fascinating. You've got questions of class, of race, of gender, as the mother of two daughters and the daughter of immigrants. This really strikes home and is very personal to me. Practical questions of registries and birth taxes, and we'll get into all that. But maybe the most important is really a moral question about the character of this country. And as a real smart conservative commentator, Linda Chavez, said at the event we did a few weeks ago that Caroline referenced, she said that ending birthright citizenship would fundamentally change what it means to be an American. And that's really the conversation we want to have with all of you today. So here's who's going to be joining us in the conversation. I'll do some brief introductions and then we'll get right into it. To my far left, as he sometimes is, but not always, not always, is Wade Henderson. I wasn't surprised to learn that, Wade, you were born in this town. You know this town. Wade Henderson is the president and CEO of the nation's premier civil and human rights coalition, LCCHR. You just changed the name? No. Leadership Conference. And it's a 200-member organization. He began his career at the ACLU, where Caroline Frederickson also was, and you were later hired to lead the NAACP's Washington Bureau. You also teach at the University of District of Columbia, correct? And you are one of my mentors from the very first day that I came into this field.
Thank you, Angie.
To my left is Margaret Stock.
To the right politically.
To the right politically. Sometimes, not always, lady. So Margaret is a litigator. She is an expert on immigration law, on citizenship law, on national security. She began her career in 1993. She served for 28 years in the Military Police Corps of the U.S. Army Reserve. She was then transferred to a retired reserve. She's a nationally recognized expert on all these issues of immigration, of citizenship, of national security. She's testified before Congress, and I have a little Outlook folder with just your name on it, because you produce so much incredible and insightful analysis on this topic and so many that I just move your emails right over and refer to them all the time. Thrilled to have you here, Margaret. To my right, but never really to my right, is Priscilla Wong, and Priscilla is the Associate Policy Director at the Asian Pacific Islander American Health Forum, which she said I can now refer to as just the Health Forum, and she directs the organization's policy work there. Before that, she served as a policy and program director at the National Asian Pacific Americans Women's Forum. You like to work at organizations with long names, yeah. She also worked with women and children in domestic violence and emergency homeless shelters, something that I did as well. You were a Georgetown Women's Law and Public Policy Fellow. I also did that. Although you were published in Harvard Law Review, and I did not do that. So congratulations, and great to have you here. And then our final speaker to my far right is Sam Fullwood III. And Sam is a dear friend and a colleague here. He's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he analyzes the influence of national politics and domestic policies on communities of color across the United States. Sam and I started at CAP at about the same time, about 2 years ago. We became fast friends immediately, and he teaches me something new almost every single day. So I feel very lucky to have you here. Thank you. And one of the things that Sam did is he wrote a terrific paper, which I urge you all to read. It's on our website, and it's entitled Less Than Citizens. And it looks at what would be the consequences of abolishing birthright citizenship. And you wrote in the paper that it would be a dark vision of America if this were to take place. And so I want you to tell us, Sam, just to kick us off, what did you learn in writing this paper?
Well, first off, I want to give credit to my colleague, Marshall Fitz, who is the Assistant Director of Immigration Policy at CAP. for co-authoring the paper with me. Right off the bat, I was skeptical and remain skeptical. So I want to sort of lay the groundwork on saying this. I think it's highly unlikely that there will be a repeal of the 14th Amendment. So having said that, and we can talk a little bit later about why it's so hard to appeal a constitutional amendment, it was important to sort of look at what the arguments people are making about repealing the 14th Amendment, even if they're going to be successful or not. And they go to the core of what it means to be an American. There was a period in American history prior to the Dred Scott decision by which people were born in the United States, and for the entirety of their life they were deemed as something other than citizens, less than citizens, which the title of the paper grew out of. Those were African Americans or black people or slaves. And the decision that sort of changed all that after the Civil War, that said what it is to be an American was that you are by the soul born. To reverse that would really be to recreate what the country was like prior to Dred Scott, wherein someone would be born without citizenship anywhere on the planet. They would be nomads in the United States without a place to be able to call that there is their home. I don't think very many people, and Margaret Stott has written this, have thought about what it means to do away with all of that, to create this sort of this class of people, a class of humanity that is not a part of any place on the globe. And that was the most shocking thing to find, that for what appears to be purely political reasons, some people are advocating doing this, even if they don't really believe in their heart of hearts that they're going to be successful in repealing the 14th Amendment.
Well, let's pick up that thread. And Wade, I want to kick it to you for a minute because, you know, you follow, it seems like every controversial debate that happens in Washington, you know about it. And immigration has certainly been probably high on that list. So why are, and it seems to be mainly Republicans, advancing this notion of repealing birthright citizenship? Sam argues it's not likely that it'll happen. Do you agree? And what's behind it?
Well, I think, first of all, Angie, you're right, and Sam is right. It's not likely to happen. But there are significant political reasons that I think are stimulating the current effort. Let me back up just for a minute. First of all, thanks to Kat, thanks to ACS for hosting this event. I think it's really important. Secondly, to clear something up at the start, I think you mentioned the Leadership Conference. We used to be the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. 2 years ago, we changed our name to become the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. There was a reason for it. Many of the issues that we work on, particularly issues about economic and social rights, are outside of the frame of fundamental constitutional issues. So the right to quality public education is not a fundamental constitutional issue, requirement. That's, you know, San Antonio versus Rodriguez. The issues of housing and health care are outside of the rights guaranteed by the Constitution, and yet a human rights frame, one that embraces the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and covenants like this Covenant on Civil and Political Rights or others that we have been signatories to, provide a framework for advancing rights that we think are important. For me, the issue has personal resonance as well as substantive resonance regarding the organization. As Angie mentioned, I grew up in Washington, D.C. The first quarter of my life was lived under a legal framework of segregation by law as well as by custom. To have been part of the movement that helped transform this country, we believe for the better, one of the most transformative civil and human rights movements of the 20th century, we think it's important that we bring those rights to bear on the issues at hand today. So just to summarize, I would say had there been no Martin Luther King speaking on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, August 27th, 1963, there would have been no Barack Obama accepting the nomination of the Democratic Party 45 years to the day that King gave his speech. And so, you know, we have to look at these things in a broader context. Now, why are we focusing on these issues? Well, the whole question of constitutional citizenship means a great deal to organizations that are grounded in the movement that I've spoken about. The truth is, the Civil War was fought in part over these issues. Now, here's what's, I think, particularly interesting. This conversation occurs 150 years after the start of the Civil War. With the exception of slavery, some of the broad issues that were under debate at that time live today. Here's what I mean by that. Look at issues of the scope of American federalism. Look at questions involving the meaning of states' rights in the 21st century. Look at issues involving questions of nullification, where some members of Congress are suggesting selective application of federal laws, particularly in the context of health care. They would nullify the Obama Affordable Health Care Act. Think about issues of secession. Even Governor Rick Perry had the audacity to talk about Texas seceding from the Union as if those issues had not been resolved. The fact that we're having a debate involving many of the fundamental issues that really enlivened the country 150 years ago are here today. One last point very quickly and then get into it. Look, I spent some time in South Carolina recently. I was there on the anniversary of Dr. King's birthday. I was at a rally at the State House where the Confederate flag flies over the state capitol as if the Civil War never ended. One of the speakers that I responded to, one of the reasons I went there is because there's a state senator in South Carolina named Danny Burton who came to Washington, D.C. on January 5th, the start of the Congress, to join with several state senators to announce the introduction of state bills that would constitute the de facto repeal of the 14th Amendment. He began his presentation by saying it was South Carolina that started the Civil War. It's South Carolina that will fight the war today. We know the malady, it's the illegal immigrant, and yet we have the cure. This is also, of course, the state with Joe Uli Wilson, who is obviously a part of the state delegation. So guys, let's not kid ourselves. These issues are alive and well, and they have great meaning. Now, why would a selected group of state senators and at the federal level, people like Steve King, the representative from Iowa who was scheduled to be the chair of the Immigration Subcommittee, who was bounced by Speaker John Boehner because of his inflammatory anti-immigrant rhetoric, why would people like that introduce a bill that they don't think could possibly become law? Well, they introduced it as part of a broader pattern, which in my view is aimed at the 2012 election cycle, one of several issues that's intended to animate their base and inflame the politics around issues like immigration, partly to drive lawfully admitted immigrants and citizens underground so that they will not depress their votes in key states that Republicans, who are largely the base of this supporters, hope to win, and because they hope to motivate their own sponsors to come to the polls by inflaming issues around the meaning of citizenship in the most direct way. So this is a craven appeal, in my view, to political gains anticipated in the 2012 election cycle, and that's why they've introduced it.
Great answer. We will come back to the politics of this. The argument that those who pursue this proposal use is they try to tie it to our broken immigration system. Our president spoke yesterday very eloquently about our broken immigration system, challenged the country to come forward and work with him to fix it. So Margaret, you're an immigration law expert. Would repealing birthright citizenship fix our broken immigration system, and what would the consequences be for people who would no longer have citizenship? I mean, just like kind of play it out for us a little bit in the context of the immigration debate.
Well, luckily, there's an easy answer to your question. No, this would not fix our nation's broken immigration system. In fact, it would break our immigration system even further. Rather than having somewhere between 8 and 20 million undocumented immigrants within the borders of the United States, if this were actually an amendment to the Constitution, overnight we would add substantially to the population of undocumented immigrants, and it would increase dramatically every year. And I'll give you some examples of some of the people whose kids would be undocumented immigrants if this constitutional amendment were passed, became part of our Constitution. A J-1 visa holder doctor working at the Veterans Administration who has a baby in the United States and who doesn't have a green card yet because she is on a 5-year waiting list for an EB-2 visa, immigrant visa, from the U.S. government, which has, a limited quota of employment-based visas for skilled professional doctors and requires them to go back home for 2 years before they're allowed to come back with a green card. That woman, doctor working at the Veterans Administration, if she gives birth to a child in the United States under this constitutional amendment, would be giving birth to an illegal immigrant. And no doubt in some states would be charged with harboring an illegal immigrant. And this is because...
Which you have to turn the baby in?
Yeah, I guess. She'd probably lose her job at the VA after being charged with the crime of having a baby that's undocumented and harboring it. But the reason for this is this amendment was proposed without any attention to how it's actually going to be implemented or its impact on how we do business right now. And as a Republican myself, and proud of the fact that the 14th Amendment was the crowning achievement of the Republican Party after the Civil War, I'm actually somewhat appalled that Republicans who pride themselves on good implementation of laws would have paid absolutely no attention to how this one's going to be implemented. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but one of the appalling facts about this proposed change to the Constitution is that there's no provision in it for any kind of comprehensive immigration reform bill that would give any legal status to children born in the United States who are not the children of a citizen parent or a lawful permanent resident parent. And today, of course, as most of you no doubt know, we have millions of lawfully resident non-citizens who are here for long, long periods of time and don't have green cards. And they are small business owners, they have e-visas, they're H-1B professional workers, they're school teachers, college professors. I mentioned VA, the VA Veterans Administration has lots of doctors in this category. And there's nothing in this amendment that would give their kids any status. And there's nothing in the current immigration code that would give any status to the US-born children of long-term, lawful, non-green card holders. So we've got a big problem there. And then on the implementation side, we've had it really good in the United States. It's really easy to prove if you're born in the United States that you're a citizen. All you have to do is produce a birth certificate. Well, maybe I said easy.
Really
okay.
easy?
Unless they question your birth certificate. But you haven't had to prove up until this point, until this proposal was put forth, you haven't had to prove your parentage at the moment of your birth. And if this goes through, what everybody born in America is going to have to do after it, and I assume it's not going to be retroactive, but at the moment of a child's birth, in order to claim American citizenship, that child will have to prove the status of the child's parents. So if your mother was approved for a green card 5 minutes before you were born, you will be a citizen. If the paperwork was delayed and your mother was approved for a green card 10 minutes after you were born, you're going to be an undocumented immigrant, the way they've written this. Because there isn't anything in the immigration law that would give you any status in that situation. You know, we have provisions for people born outside the United States to ride on their parents' visas, but we don't have anything for people born inside, and they haven't put that into the amendment. The other thing to understand is we already know how this will work because we already have a model of how difficult it is to prove citizenship through your parents. The United States is not just a country that confers birthright citizenship. It's also a country that confers what lawyers call jus sanguinis, or derivative citizenship, or citizenship by blood. And we do that all the time. We confer citizenship on the children of some US citizens who have children outside the borders of the United States. We don't confer citizenship on every single child of a US citizen born outside the United States. Our laws in that regard are statutory. Congress changes them all the time. They're an extremely complex web of laws, and it takes a really good immigration lawyer to tell somebody who has a baby outside the United States, yes, your baby is an American citizen, or no, your baby is not. It turns on factors such as whether the parents were lawfully married at the time of the birth, whether the US citizen parent is the mother or the father of the child, how much time the parent had in the United States prior to the child's birth overseas, and all that sort of thing. And right now, determinations about whether kids born overseas to Americans are US citizens are made by the United States Department of State and by the Department of Homeland Security. Now, first thing I should tell you is they take a long time to make these decisions. They require a lot of paperwork, and they charge a lot of money. The Department of Homeland Security charges currently $600 a head to determine whether a child born outside the United States is a citizen and to issue a citizenship certificate to the parents. And they don't issue the certificate within a matter of days or weeks. Sometimes it takes months and months, sometimes even years. I should also tell you that it's not reassuring to know that the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security disagree sometimes on whether somebody is a citizen or not. So the State Department may issue a passport to a child born outside the United States, and the parents of that child will be told when they apply for a certificate of citizenship to the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, part of DHS, that state has made a mistake and their child is not really a U.S. citizen, and that DHS thinks that the child was erroneously issued a U.S. passport. I know a number of military families who have had that problem, and luckily we've gotten it reversed, but not without a lot of expensive legal work. So what's the net impact if we change the rule? Well, when a child's born in the United States in a hospital, the child will no longer be simply issued a certificate that proves the child is a citizen. The child will have to document the status of the parents at the moment of the child's birth, presumably by sending those documents off to a government agency that will make that determination. The government agency is not going to do it for free because it's going to be very, very expensive to do this. And the shorthand, and I think you've talked about this in your paper extensively, we can say it's going to be roughly a $600 baby tax on every child born in the United States when this goes into effect. It won't just affect undocumented immigrants. It's going to be every child born in the United States. Their parents will have to pay this baby tax for the privilege. We're also going to be creating a very large bureaucracy. There will be some good jobs coming from this bureaucracy. Very, very good jobs for immigration lawyers, because there's going to be a lot of litigation. And I can tell you that because I've been involved in a lot of litigation over children who are born outside the U.S. and whether they're citizens or not, and even some litigation over people born here and whether they're citizens or not. But litigation is going to involve some very interesting questions, like, you know, the question I mentioned earlier about what time did my mother get status X? Was that really my father? I think my real father was the sperm donor who gave the sperm to the sperm bank, and he was a U.S. citizen. So, you know, it says parent, therefore I'm really a U.S. citizen. We're going to have people being asked to be surrogate parents because they are U.S. citizens, and if they're the surrogate parent of the child, of the egg and the sperm donated by somebody else, then that will give them citizenship in the United States. So we're going to have all kinds of wacky stuff going on that nobody thought about. And will this solve the problem of illegal immigration? Absolutely not. It's going to increase the number of illegal immigrants in the country.
All right, good. Orwellian, terrifying, but I think a straight and thorough analysis. So there's a lot that we don't know, whether this will happen, what it'll look like, if it does happen, when it does happen. But the one thing we know is that there are about 4 million kids born every single year, and at each one of those births is a woman, is their mother, and I can tell you, as a woman who's given birth twice, my husband nearly left. This is when I was pregnant with our first one. He got in the car and forgot me, and then he looked around. So to the idea of him remembering to bring any documents at all was beyond him. He struggled to bring me, and then of course we hit every red light, and what was like it's only a 3-mile drive to the hospital, and he was stopped there at 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm like, I think you can run the light. So that was my experience. But Priscilla, you've given a lot of thought to this, right? What does it mean for women, for immigrant women, women of color, who may not have the right ID when they go into labor? Just talk a little bit about that from the research you've done.
Sure. So, well, first of all, I also just wanted to thank ACS and CAP for hosting this and for inviting me to this panel. It's really fun and quite a thrill to be up here with all of you. I want to go back to the point actually that Sam made when he started, which is, you know, the controversy around birthright citizenship is really a question about what defines Americanism, who is American, and who decides what makes you an American. So, and for that reason, I think, you know, I wasn't surprised to hear that the founder of the California Coalition for Immigration Reform, which is actually an anti-immigrant organization, has described birthright citizenship as invasion by birth canal. And I want to unpack this. And I should just warn folks, I'm going to be talking about uteruses and wombs.
You go, girlfriend. We're
And
fine.
so if you're queasy about
it.
that,
This
you
is
might
Cap.
want to stay around. But the idea that you can invade the U.S. through a woman's birth canal and through her uterus it is not new. I mean, there are kind of two assumptions that underpin this. One, there's this popular mythology that immigrants are coming to the U.S. to reap the benefits of our very generous public welfare, educational, and healthcare systems. Sometimes when I talk about this issue, actually with high school students or younger folks, I like to use a Kegel cartoon that I think really illustrates this really well. And so in the cartoon, there's a fence and barbed wire around the fence, and there's a line of people on both sides and a tunnel that's been dug underneath the fence. And on one side of it are the immigrants. On the other side, there are 4 kind of stations. And at the first station, you go to get your free lemonade. At the second station, you go and you get a free education. The third station, they hand out health care. And at the fourth one, you get a job. And so that's the perception that people come here to do that. The other myth that is related to that is that immigrant women in particular come to the U.S. in order to have what conservatives call anchor babies. If you're not familiar with the term, the anchor baby is the idea that a child born in the U.S. of undocumented immigrants, because they are a citizen, can later sponsor a relative into the country. And so, and actually Senator Graham over the summer referred to this phenomenon as a drop-and-leave policy, which was really offensive. The only time the word drop has been used to describe a pregnancy or a birth usually refers to animals, not to human beings, as dropping a baby. So this idea that because women have childbearing capabilities, because demographically immigrant women come to the U.S. when they're of an age where they come here to work, and because of that, they are usually healthy. They're of that age where they can have children. They do want to start families just like the rest of us. They are targeted, and they have been targeted for a long time. I would argue that birthright citizenship and the fear around this is really not necessary. For a lot of reasons, but one specifically because we still have a public charge determination where Department of Homeland Security can still use their discretionary power to either deny entry or reentry or even deport or even deny adjustment of status based on a public charge determination, which really often has a disproportionate impact on low-income immigrant women if they are going through a pregnancy and need help to pay for health care. They could DHS could find that they are a public charge. So the implications are vast. There are actually a lot of really great examples I could share later about how this question of whether an immigrant woman who gives birth, if they are giving birth to a U.S. citizen or basically somebody who is an other in this country, I think really illustrates well what's the controversy that's really at the heart of all of this.
Angie, can I just offer a clarification about something, though, because I think for the audience, this conversation about a constitutional amendment to abolish, constitutional citizenship, birthright citizenship, seems far-fetched. There is a process that an amendment goes through, considered in both houses of Congress, votes in the Judiciary Committee, votes out of the Congress and so forth, and state ratification. The likelihood that will happen is far-fetched. It's remote. But what's really at issue right now is a group of proposals that have been introduced commonly in several state legislatures that really would do 2 things. One is a bill that would seek to define state citizenship for the first time, so that these individuals, children who are born in these states, it's obviously about federal citizenship indirectly, but the actual legislation would restrict a grant of state citizenship for the first time. And it would argue, for example, the practical effects may be to refuse issuing birth certificates to children in this status, or to put an asterisk on a birth certificate so that you know this child is not a citizen as we define it in our own country. Now, why, and the other bill, the second bill, would allow states to create what are called state compacts. In other words, if you adopt an identical bill around citizenship, you would then be able to go to Congress and say, look, Arizona, Kansas, Florida, a group of states have worked together, and we'd like to have a state compact to have full faith and credit to recognize what each state has done. And they would present that compact to Congress for ratification. Probably wouldn't come up in the Senate because there are many senators who would oppose it. But in the House with its current composition, you would likely get a vote, and the vote may win. And what you then have is the imprimatur of the House of Representatives on these proposals in a way that give them faux legitimacy. Now, this issue, from our perspective, is important because I think what is really being done is to put these issues out as if somehow they are responding to the immigration problem, but they're really intended to inflame passions that run deeply in every state in the country over the failure of the federal government to respond to what many Americans see as a crisis with immigration reform. What's quite ironic is that President Obama has begun to really demonstrate his hands-on commitment to getting a comprehensive bill through. Yet he's been, stymied in that effort, and he takes the political blame, while the Republicans who have obstructed his effort to move legislation apparently get off scot-free. So there's no real incentive to revisit these issues in a way that works. So that's point one. Go ahead,
wait,
Sam.
your point really goes to the heart of the strategy when you start throwing out crazy proposals, whatever they might be. It's the sort of a shell game. You're not looking at what the real problem is, so that the people who are really causing the problem are not ever held to blame for it. Whoever's in power, or whoever the public perceives as being able to do something about it, incorrectly in this case, then becomes the focal point, and you've really bollocksed up the whole political system. And that's exactly the strategy behind why this 14th Amendment repeal is so potent and should be a concern to average citizens, because you have to understand what the strategy is so that you don't get duped into thinking that something like this, which never will happen, won't distract you.
But what would the effect of a caste system be? Because that's in effect what we're asking. I mean, we would create two categories of citizenship, or two statuses of one a group of citizens, the other less than citizen. Why would you create a caste system, and what would the practical effects of that be? Margaret talked about the various legal statuses that would be difficult to sort out, so those are there. But think about it. Many of these individuals, these kids, would go to poor quality public schools, from which now about 50% of both African American and Latino kids don't graduate. All right, so you're kids without high school diplomas, with no real ability, no health care in the most fundamental sense, and no ability to transform their status, which is one of the hallmarks of what our democracy affords every individual who is here. I mean, the meaning of equal opportunity in our country is that you can change the circumstances of your birth, and the opportunity is real. In places where there is a caste system like that which would be created here, the practical effects would be disastrous. One example, this is the 10th anniversary of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It's a bill that responds to the primarily needs of women and children who are trafficked into the United States. About 20,000 come in annually. Most of these women obviously are not citizens of the United States. Some of them, some small percentage of them, have children every year.
Of course.
Think about the effect of denying citizenship status to the children of women who have been trafficked into the United States, forced into prostitution through no fault of their own, where we purport on the one hand to be concerned about their circumstance, and on the other, we've just consigned their children to a permanent underclass status. I mean, what is that about?
It also bars citizenship to the children of Iraqi refugees who've been brought into the United States, any other refugees, persons with temporary protected status who have children in the United States. There's a whole host of immigration categories that are excluded from the definition. Parent is a citizen or, lawful permanent resident. And there are populations that are...
projecting this into the future
Right.
indefinitely, because the children of illegal, undocumented, native-born Americans would be not citizens, and their children wouldn't be citizens, and their children wouldn't be citizens, and there's no way to break that cycle once
Right.
you start that caste system.
And Sam, I think you looked at this in your paper a little bit, experiences that other countries have had, how those children have performed that have had to live under the system that Wade was just describing. You want to talk a little bit about that?
The history seems to suggest that in countries where the caste system is entrenched, Germany immediately comes to mind with the population of Turks that are embedded. Their academic performance, their job performance after schools tends to be substantially deteriorated compared to the citizens, and that stems from a number of factors. One is the inherent discrimination that people have from giving jobs and opportunities to people who aren't perceived to be citizens, and the cost on them as outcasts in the country that they are born into. That their desire to sort of to move up in a system is curtailed because there is no moving up in that system.
Right, and I think Germany has actually moved to change their laws to give some sort of status to the kids of guest workers now. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Right, seeing the negative ramifications.
And a key point of the German example is it didn't solve an illegal immigration problem to have this rule. You know, you often hear people say, well, if we could only change birthright citizenship, that's going to solve our immigration problem. There's absolutely no evidence that changing the rules, other countries that have changed the rules have not solved any immigration problems. It appears they have created more immigration problems. Today, by the way, the DREAM Act is apparently being introduced.
Has been introduced,
Or has
yes.
been introduced on Capitol Hill. And I mention that because we see in the example provided by the DREAM Act students a vision of what America will look like in the future times 10 if we allow the Constitution to be changed. The 14th Amendment has been the great equalizer.
Yes.
It says everybody starts life on the same foot, at least if you're born in America. Now, right now, we have this population of young people who were brought to the United States when they were very young. They've gone to our schools here. They're Americanized for all purposes. For the most part, you can't tell them from somebody who was born here and grew up right next to them. But when they finish their high school education and they're ready to contribute to society, we tell them, no, you have no documents, you can't get a job, you can't join the United States military, you're barred from joining the military. We're going to have that problem multiplied many, many times. We're going to have an even bigger cohort of, quote, DREAM Act people, except they will be people we can't deport to any other country because they were born here.
Right.
And many of them won't have citizenship in any other country, so there's no place to deport them back to. And since I mentioned the military, I do want to mention, since I did serve for 28 years and I'm now retired, that there's a huge cohort of birthright citizens serving in the United States military today. In fact, statistically, there's an extremely good chance that there was a birthright citizen on SEAL Team 6 because the percentage of birthright citizens serving in the armed forces today is so high. And it's much, much likelier that a birthright citizen was serving on SEAL Team 6 than it is that a birthright citizen will perform an act of terrorism against the United States. There's many, many more birthright citizens serving in the United States Armed Forces proudly today. I know this because I talk to them on the phone all the time. They call looking for help trying to get their parents legal. It's a problem.
Well, it's funny that you raise that because a restrictionist-leaning group, the Center for Immigration Studies, released a report recently entitled "Birthright Citizenship for Children of Visitors: A National Security Problem in the Making?" Question mark.
Oh, God.
Right. Well, we still haven't had a case of a terror baby, but we have had.
Terror, baby.
Yeah. Their phrases, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Well, you said anchor baby, so. We have had birthright citizens rise to the highest levels of our government. We've had one who is an attorney general, United States Attorney General. We've had one who was a United States Senator, at least one. We have a number of them that have served in high public office, in the military, in state and local governments, professors at colleges and universities across America, and more mundane things like small business owners and so forth and so on. But there's no doubt about it that one of the reasons the United States is a superpower today is because of the 14th Amendment. It's something that's attracted people to America and made them feel like they could live up to their full potential.
We're not a country club.
We're not a country club, and we don't have a caste system.
Exactly. Right.
Well, you know, and again, this will be my last intervention on these issues, but One of the practical effects of this, I lie. I mean, one of the
We like it, though. It's okay.
one of the practical effects of this, though, is really to disfranchise individuals who would otherwise be able to, help shape their own destiny by participating in the political process. I mean, think about the consequences now, in practical terms, of some of the new voter ID initiatives, which are being adopted across the country. There are many individuals who are citizens who don't have the requisite documentation to prove their citizenship for purposes of participating in voting in elections in their state under the definitions that have now been established. The Supreme Court has upheld this. Some states have said that they will assist those who don't have the documentation to get it. But in practical terms, there will be thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, of individuals who would otherwise have been eligible to vote, who will now be barred from that process because we have redefined what citizenship means. Think about it in terms of the former felons who have served their penalty and for crimes committed, who are now barred in selected states from voting, ever restoring their right to vote. In practical terms, you have millions of individuals who fall in that category. It's not just anti-democratic. I mean, it creates a system which is guaranteed to shape political results in the future, which is, again, why I think these proposals have been introduced, the timing of them, and why they're being stoked in state election campaigns rather than at the federal level.
And we already went through this experiment.
Right.
I mean, numerous times, but the one that comes to mind is with the Deficit Reduction Act of 2005, Congress had imposed citizenship verification requirements for Medicaid beneficiaries and enrollees. And we know from that lesson it was very expensive. There was a GAO report that tracked how it was implemented in 6 states. I believe it cost over $8 million to go through about 3.5 million Medicaid beneficiaries, and out of that 3.5 million, they found 8 people, who were ineligible for Medicaid. And Congress did something about that. So with CHIPRA 2009, they amended that requirement so that states no longer have, they have the option of using other records and going back to, using the processes they had in place before the 2005 DRA requirements. And the practical implications of that, we know, were that the people who were actually most affected were U.S.-born children, U.S.-born elderly, particularly those in the South who, and I believe a lot of them were African Americans who were born at a time when you were not allowed to go to the hospital to give birth, and so they don't have birth certificates. The implications were also, people actually, children and the elderly, all of them U.S. citizens were actually kicked off of Medicaid and CHIP because they were not able to produce the proper documents to prove their citizenship. So this idea that, that it's easy to prove your citizenship, that, every American should be able to provide documents to prove that is actually false.
The one thing that we have found, which I'm really heartened by, is the fact that scholars on all sides of the issue, regardless of political affiliation, and individuals of both major parties, Republican and Democratic, have stepped up to criticize these proposals in ways that I think have been encouraging. We helped foster creation of a group called Americans for Constitutional Citizenship. It's about 80 prominent individuals, organizations around the country. You have people who've served in the Bush administration, like James Ho, who also worked in the Texas state government. You have people like Linda Chavez and Walter Dellinger and others who have crossed ideological lines, who have crossed party lines to come together to say this is simply not right. We don't want an America in the 21st century to foster a new caste system that creates innumerable problems, doesn't respond to the issue at hand, and is so fundamentally antithetical to what America stands for today that we have to speak out. And I think that number is growing. I think we have been successful on the ground. in challenging the adoption of these amendments, or rather provisions, even in the states that have the most heated battleground for immigration reform. And so I think, with people like Margaret and Priscilla, obviously, Sam, with your good work, I think that we are making the case which is being heard. And I'm thrilled that even Speaker Boehner, when confronted with a member of his own party who he was about to elevate to a subcommittee chairmanship of the immigration subcommittee, saw how this issue would inflame the debate, he refused to grant him the chairmanship. Now, it might have been nice to have the nut as a chairman, but he's not. So, and we'll have to deal with that accordingly, but I think it was a good
That's a great point, Wade. Sam, I want to go to you for a second, and then we're going to open it up for questions, because you study race in this country, right? You know where the tensions are, and where people can step on landmines and things can blow up. Is this an issue that has that potential? Do you see, as Wade was suggesting, that many people will come together and set aside other differences and stand up against this? Or will the loudmouths be able to break through and stoke fear, and the politics of division will prevail? Like, how do you see this playing?
As I said earlier, I don't think that this is going to play out well, but I think it has.
Well, for us, or for those who are
For the advocates of repealing,
proponents of
I just
repeal.
don't think that's going to happen. But it has when people talk about race in the 21st century, they don't talk about race as they talked about race, say, in the 19th century or in the early or the first half of the 20th century. And I think we have people like the late Lee Atwater to blame for how we talk about race. You talk about something else in a coded way so that it becomes, I think the current phrase for it is dog whistle politics. So that when you start talking about birthright citizenship, you really are talking about race. You really are. But you're not talking about race in a way that if you're on Fox News, that people can say that you're talking about race. So that the people who are advocating these kinds of policies, they know that there's an audience that gets what they're saying. I happen to believe that that audience is small, dying, old, and enfeebled, and politically frightened out of its mind.
Okay.
And so that this dog whistle is responding to probably the least effective political component. It is still potent.
Yeah.
But it is diminishing in its power, and I think that over the long term that there's not much likelihood that they will
Continue
prevail.
to diminish.
Yes.
All right.
There is a very real problem, though, that some people are concerned about, and that's this issue that gets raised about birth tourism.
Yes, let's talk about
you
that.
know,
for a minute.
very-
Yeah, explain
very-
what that is for the audience, and
Well,
then I promise we'll go to questions.
it's a lot like what Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt did when they ran off to Africa to have their baby. It's wealthy people saying, gosh, America is a country where if you have your child there, your child will get a United States passport, and then in the future, I won't have to worry about if Junior gets into Stanford, they won't have to get a student visa, they'll be a U.S. citizen. So it's parents basically saying, gosh, it would be really cool for my child to have citizenship in another country, and I might be concerned about the stability of the country that I belong to, and I'm looking out for my child's future. There are lesser ways to deal with that issue than amending the United States Constitution and inconveniencing every single baby born in America. You could, for example, put something in the immigration code that says you're inadmissible to the United States if you're coming solely for the purpose of having a baby here. Nobody's even proposed that as a bill in Congress, but that's a possibility. Another very effective method for dealing with wealthy parents who are coming here to have babies is to present them with a copy of the Internal Revenue Code and point out to them that the United States government taxes all of its birthright citizens throughout their lifetime on their worldwide income, no matter where it is earned. And when Junior's going to apply for a passport, the United States government would like to see proof that their child has paid taxes to the United States government. And I think that would go far more towards solving this issue. A lot of these parents have no clue that they're...
Margaret, I'm glad you're on our team.
They don't understand that when their child's born in the United States, the child is subject to U.S. income tax for the rest of their life. And it's on worldwide income, not just income earned in the United States. By the way, the IRS does currently have a voluntary compliance program for all American citizens who are out of compliance with this. So you've been told about that. If you're not declaring your Mexican income, you need to do that this year. That wasn't tax advice, though. And they're not telling people that they're subject to, U.S. worldwide criminal jurisdiction, that they're not subject, if there's a military draft again, their progeny will be subject to the military draft and won't be able to opt out. They're not told about the responsibilities that come along with American citizenship. So I think if the government had a little bit of an education campaign for some of these wealthy families,
Great.
that problem would go away and we wouldn't have to change the Constitution.
As I said, we can go after it with a fly swatter, not an Uzi.
Yeah.
Very good, good ideas. All right, let's open it up to the audience. I've been lucky enough to ask these good folks questions, and let's see if anyone in the audience would like to do the same. All right, we'll start there. Richard Fulton.
Richard Fulton from the American Jewish Committee. Terrific discussion. In discussing the proposals to amend the Constitution, there of course have also been proposals, legislative proposals, which it strikes me, the strategy there is if something can get passed in a state, that these advocates will then turn to the courts and try to get a reinterpretation of the 14th Amendment. So how serious a problem is this? How concerned ought we to be about that strategy?
That's a great question, Richard, and I think you've really put your finger on what the larger strategy is. As I said, I think proposals for federal constitutional amendments are outside of the bound of real possibility. I think there are a number of states, let's just pick a number, 10 or so, that have at various stages of their legislative process simply legislative proposals that would try to redefine state citizenship for the first time. The assumption is that groups like the ACLU, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund will all rush into court, will challenge these statutes, and to some degree are likely to win in the lower courts. The case will then be appealed to the federal courts of appeals in the jurisdiction and then ultimately to the Supreme Court, where advocates believe that the court may in fact reinterpret the 14th Amendment and its application by way of some of these state statutes. Now, those who are scholars in this field sort of dismiss that as not truly credible. On the other hand, I read the court decisions in the campaign finance area, Citizens United, which seemed to turn law on its head that had long been established. I read the court's decision in the Lilly Ledbetter versus Goodyear Tire and Rubber case, where 30 years of enforcement was flipped on its head. Stranger things have happened under the current composition of the court. So I would not assume that it could not get a credible airing. It may not happen, but I think a credible airing is achievable, and I think the strategy is based on the assumption that the court is not a predictable entity in this context and will come down with decisions as they deem appropriate. But I also think by using the state law, these activists are really being creative in giving incentives to people who share their view, who are, by the way, not racist, not taking extreme positions that we might criticize in an open way. But I think, as Sam alluded to, they will be appealed to by the subtleties of what these proposals would suggest. So they can feel perfectly comfortable in supporting restrictions on constitutional citizenship without feeling that they violated fundamental views about race or about American values. And they will then use those incentives to increase the level of voter turnout and to depress contrary points of view at the polls. I think it's a very intelligent strategy.
There's also a strategy of attempting to introduce a bill into Congress that would have Congress redefine the term subject to the jurisdiction to mean something it hasn't meant. The State Department hasn't adopted this new interpretation, but there's a theory that you can do that. I think if they succeed on that, though, we're going to see similar groups that have other problems with other amendments trying the same thing. Gun control advocates, for example, will try to redefine arms in the First Amendment to mean spears and knives only, and we'll have.
Right.
So I think there's an issue. Most legal scholars don't think that Congress has the power to alter a constitutional term where there's a big legislative history. And I think your last panel talked about the legislative history on that.
We looked into that.
Yeah.
All right, next question, the lady in the front, second row there.
A question for you. Oh, I'm sorry. I have a question for you. I forget which one of you said that this was a moral question. Oh, okay. Now, since we're only one of 2 first world countries that have birthright citizenship, would you say the other countries, France, Germany, England, Australia, are immoral? And also, I'm curious about the the fact that other countries, for example, I'll use Mexico, the Mexican Constitution in Chapter 2, Article 30, Paragraph 2 states that any baby born in a foreign territory, and the President of Mexico said including the United States, is a citizen of Mexico, subject to the jurisdiction of the citizen of the country of Mexico. So how does the subject to the jurisdiction of, I'm kind of curious, how does that interpret when you have another country and another constitution saying those people are citizens of our country subject to our jurisdiction? And then finally, about, you used the term terror baby, I think. Isn't Anwar al-Awlaki a person born to somebody in New Mexico who had expired visas, and because he was given birthright citizenship, he could come back and forth, and that's why they call him an American-born cleric? So isn't there at least some danger of terrorism, not just immigrants or gardeners and nannies, but some danger
I
of
think we got it.
terrorism?
Good question.
No, those are
Let
good
me-
questions.
Let me respond to the
All right,
moral
and then
part
the
of it and
Okay.
the American. I'm glad you asked that too. There is a notion, particularly advanced by conservatives, but also embraced by progressives as well, that America is an exceptional country. You hear them talk about American exceptionalism. And that goes expressly to this whole idea about what makes us exceptional. When you look at the 14th Amendment, which is one of those things that we talked about in the last panel,
Yep.
We don't necessarily follow the rules that other countries follow because we believe our rules are moral and just. It's not to say that, because they do things in Switzerland the way they do them in Switzerland, that they're immoral. It's just that we believe that our experiment with democracy is exceptional. And one of the things that we hold out to be that is you're born here, you are an American, end of story. That is sort of, that goes to the heart of what makes you an American. And we believe that very, very fundamentally as a part of what it is to be American. There are, I think, more than 2 countries. I think there are about 4 countries or more. Yeah, well, there are more countries that have the exceptional birthright status. There are other countries that have seen fit to repeal their statutes against that. But that's an argument, particularly that you hear from conservatives. So what if they do that in other countries? We are Americans. We do things the way we believe that are consistent with our moral values. And this is one that is fundamental to the country, I believe.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I would just add a grace note. I mean, I think there are other examples of American exceptionalism where there's a fairly consistent point of view that the American view, shaped by its Constitution and the amendments, the Bill of Rights, makes a huge difference. So I often tell students, look, if there were not a First Amendment to the Constitution, there would not have been a civil rights movement as we know it in this country. The ability to speak out, to have protected speech from government action is unique to the United States and the First Amendment. And when you look at Europe, which is obviously as civilized and offers as much opportunity in many respects for its citizens, it's a great distinction. This country is arguably the world's largest, most diverse Republican democracy. And to have a democracy in which not so much the individual and the majority gets to determine what's right, but rather we have a structure that obviously respects majority interests, but also protects the rights of political minorities. It has allowed this diversity to flourish under a structure that has permitted our government to avoid many of the political upheavals that you see in other countries. I think it has been said that the 14th Amendment is the great equalizer. And when you think about what that means in practical terms, it means everything. That's why I began my presentation by saying, look, I know about the transformative power of a democratic system in producing an end result different from the beginning. And so if we overturn legal segregation, which, as I said, I lived under for the first quarter of my life, I didn't like it. It just didn't sit well with me, let me be frank. So the bottom line is I'm very honored that I helped bring about change. And you can only do that in a country that has this kind of view about itself and about the protections that these amendments provide.
Did you want to add anything?
Okay, let me deal with the last burning question you had. You cannot tell whether somebody's going to be a terrorist based on their parent's status at their birth. That doesn't correlate. Thousands of terrorists had American citizen parents. We just had a case up in Alaska with somebody named Lawrence Rockwood who worked for the National Weather Service who was prosecuted as a terrorist. He had a hit list of federal employees he was out to get. He was the U.S.-born child of Americans. We have had people radicalized over the internet inside the United States whose parentage goes back hundreds of years. So there isn't a correlation, and for people to make the argument that somehow we're going to stop terrorism by getting rid of birthright citizenship, it just doesn't make sense to say that. You did have a really important question, though, relating to citizenship laws of other countries. It's just a fact right now that every country in the world makes its own laws regarding citizenship, and the U.S. government doesn't control the other countries. So Mexico can have whatever laws it wants, Ecuador can have its laws, England, France, Saudi Arabia, and we don't control them. Ireland has a law that everybody with one Irish grandparent is an Irish citizen. So lots of Americans are dual citizens of Ireland and America, and they can't do anything about it. They just happen to have an Irish grandparent, and they can claim Irish citizenship and work in the EU if they want, with an Irish passport. Every country makes its own laws and can also change them too at whim. So it's, getting back to the idea of people only owing allegiance to one country, that's not very common in the modern world. There just aren't that many people that are in that situation anymore because of the diversity and the globalization and so forth and so on. The original language, though, of the 14th Amendment, subject to the jurisdiction, had very specific meaning that's laid out in the debates, and I think you went over this last time, but just to refresh everybody's memory, it meant that you were subject to the laws of the United States. So in other words, if you were a diplomat with diplomatic immunity, you were not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, and your children would not be U.S. citizens at birth. That's still the law today. Diplomats who have children inside the United States, if those diplomats have diplomatic immunity, their children are given green cards because there's a provision in the law to give them green cards. But there's nothing in the law to give anybody else a green card except the diplomat's kids. The law also covered invading armies. If an army was to invade the United States and the army had a lot of soldiers who were having babies in the United States, that army would not be subject to the laws of the United States. It would be governed by international law and the laws of war, and so the babies born to that invading army would not be subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. And then, of course, back when the amendment was passed, sovereign Indian tribes were considered not subject to the jurisdiction because you couldn't sue somebody who was a Native American in court, so they weren't considered subject to the jurisdiction. So there were actually groups that were considered not subject to our jurisdiction. Now, Mexico can interpret their language any way they want, and there's not anything that we can do about that. In fact, if Mexico wanted to do this, they could simply change their law so that no baby born of Mexican parents in the United States is a Mexican citizen. And if they did that, then we would be forced to, keep all these kids. And in fact, under the state compacts, all those kids would be Americans. So one of the interesting things about the state laws is they actually cede a lot of sovereignty to foreign countries because the state compact has a stateless provision in it. And if the parents do not apply for citizenship in another country, then the child derives U.S. citizenship by virtue of birth here. So the state compacts are actually not going to deal with the problem of illegal immigration at all. The rhetoric doesn't match the language of the law that they're trying to pass. The big people are going to be hurt by that one are people who came in legally and have documentary proof that their kid belongs to another country.
See, I think you're right, Margaret. I think the state compacts are being used to solicit a vote in the House of Representatives to argue then that the House has supported these state initiatives to give them more credence. I mean, obviously it doesn't have any legal force in effect, but politically it's very good for members to be able to have their member of Congress or others on the record voting either, taking a vote. It's like the Ryan budget, which has now become a political hot potato for some in some jurisdictions because they voted for it. So too would an issue like this be used politically by one side or the other to go after their members. Your questions were very good.
Thank you. Good questions. And let's see if there's anybody. There you go. If you could, Billy, the woman to your right. Okay, good. I thought she had her hand up. Maybe not. There you go.
Yeah. I had a question for the professor. How much of this actually becomes a a question of creating some sort of class conflict and establishing classism. More, I mean, we talk about the United States as not being class, you know, that's for the British or, you know, other places that have caste. But it seems to me that you can't talk about race without talking about class. You can't talk about class without looking at our immigration laws going back to the 19-teens. You can't do that. I mean, when I was listening to you, I realized that I'm a birthright person because of the way my grandparents came here in the 19-teens. So aren't we really talking about creating some sort of classism?
I think that a couple of us are professors, but
Right.
yeah. Look,
Scholarly group.
I mean, I framed it as a caste system, not so much as a class system, but within that caste system, there are class implications. And here's what I mean by that. The intent is to go after those that we deem to be the children of the undocumented, who are viewed as the kids who benefited from their parents' violation of our immigration laws. And as a general matter, when people smuggle either themselves or their families into the United States, the assumption is that they have come for economic reasons, the majority. Obviously, there are many as well who have come for reasons out of fear of harm in their own country, and sometimes those individuals are given a protective status, known as temporary protective status under the law. Salvadorans benefited from that in the early 1990s.
They still do.
And they still do. They'd be harmed by this, so it's a good example. I think that, truthfully, this is really intended not so much to foster class distinctions, but it recognizes that they exist and it's going to capitalize on the deep resentments that exist within American society that don't go necessarily to questions of whether the individual who harbors these views is a racist. Let's take that issue off the table. I think there are individuals who can look at these issues and come up with perfectly plausible questions, reasonable questions, that don't in any way stigmatize the person who asked the question as a racist. I mean, to say that foreign countries treat their citizens different, or children who are born in their countries differently than the U.S. is a legitimate issue, and let's look at it. But my point is that it has an insidious dimension to it. Because obviously, if people are interested in responding to the immigration problem, they would demonstrate what this provision would do to reduce immigration as we know it in an objective way that could be examined and studied. When you look at those issues today, there's no doubt that it has nothing to do with controlling immigration reform. And that's really my view. Go ahead.
We got no cost-benefit analysis
None.
on this thing done at all. This is not a fiscally conservative measure whatsoever. And nobody has run the numbers saying that there is any fiscal case for doing this. There's no, chart saying we're going to stop X amount of illegal immigration, save so much money from detention, et cetera, et
You
cetera.
know it's going to cost
None
because
of
there's
that,
a
no.
birth tax.
We
to it
just
that you
know that we're
described.
going to have to create a new bureaucracy. Every baby's going to have their status
Right.
verified. It's going to be really, really expensive. Nobody's even run the numbers on that except, in your report today, I think is the first time I've
Yes.
seen somebody
Right.
actually run the numbers on that. And the proponents of this have the burden of showing that there is a good reason, not just moral, not just politically, but we've got major budget deficits here. What's the fiscal argument for doing this? Is this going to add? No, it's going to reduce our tax base, reduce our kick our demographics out of whack in the future, because these are young people that would be reducing our demographic aging population problem. But nobody's done that analysis, and they need to do that.
But you did refer to something, though, and I'm sorry to cut you off. Let me have you go.
Priscilla and then Wade, and then we'll go to the next question.
Thanks. I do think there's an element of population politics in all of this, because we've been hearing a lot with the new census numbers that this country is on track to becoming a majority minority sooner than we thought. I also don't think it's an accident that birthright citizenship, this repeal effort, has really kind of come to the forefront in the last couple of decades as our population changes. And I think, and I do agree. I mean, I do think it's a way to talk about race relations. I know you're talking about class, but I do think it is a way to talk about race relations in a coded manner that is really about national origin discrimination. And that is tied very directly to race discrimination. The practical implication, again, is, a woman, if you can imagine, a woman shows up, even a pregnant woman, even just showing up at the hospital could trigger, based on her appearance, somebody's decision to ask for citizenship papers or not, without knowing anything about that person's background. And we know that already happens, where women have been racially profiled through 287G programs, and they all do turn out to be immigrant women, but they're initially racially profiled based on their appearance as a Latino, for example. And so if you can kind of imagine what happens after that, knowing that women are going to be, and immigrant women in particular, are going to be the target and subject to this kind of scrutiny, it creates a chilling effect. It deters all women, actually, I think, in a lot of ways, and women of color in particular, from seeking out care at hospitals, from going to their providers, if they are not confident that they're able to provide the proper documentation to prove their citizenship. And then what happens afterwards with their kids? If they are still fearful of going to seek care, they will not be bringing their child to the hospital, to a provider, to get vaccinated. And as Sam has alluded to, you create generation after generation of people who are completely stateless and have, even though they, by virtue of growing up here, have been integrated into U.S. society, are practically invisible for all government, in the government's eyes.
But you've studied the demographics, isn't this going to aggravate the conflict as we have a large cohort of young people who have no citizenship in our country and a growing group of older people who have citizenship? Isn't there going to be an inevitable conflict between the older group that's privileged by virtue of having been born before this amendment got changed?
Right. I mean, I think that's why this issue is emerging.
No, I think that's right. I mean, but I think there are those who hold the view that demographics are destiny. And there is a sense of anxiety that many Americans of long-term status have about the changing demographics of the country. I mean, we've talked for the last 20 years about the browning of America. To the extent that we look at census data from 2010, it suggests that obviously there have been demographic changes that have great significance. And so the fact that the last election cycle produced voters in states like Colorado and New Mexico and Florida that changed the party affiliation of those states by virtue of the fact that you now have an immigrant population that you didn't have before has gained notice from politicians on both sides of the aisle. And they are looking at these issues in practical terms. The issue of class, however, which you alluded to, I think really is not so much the effort to embrace class divisions. To some degree, they're ignored in the context of the DREAM Act students that we've talked about. I mean, these are young people who, by and large, the business community is anxious to keep here in the United States. They are high-achieving academically, and they either want to pursue college education that will make them potentially the workforce of tomorrow, or they want to serve their country in the military. Now, what could be better? At a time when the service is an all-volunteer operation, and the quality of those who enter the service needs to be maintained at a certain level. Everyone, argues that we have the best army we've ever had, and that's wonderful, best military. But these are students who are needed and used, and yet there are those who are willing to send them back to countries that they have no remembrance of whatsoever, simply to make an ideological point that doesn't serve the national interest that they purport to represent. So I think this is a complicated issue. I think this panel has been a useful further development of these issues. I think these challenging questions are good. I think, though, that what is ultimately going to be needed is an organized effort to push back on those who would use a false issue for craven political purposes, when in fact the issue itself is inherently anti-democratic. And I think we have an obligation to do that.
Caroline, you had a question?
Yeah, well, it was actually one of the things that was interesting to me was thinking about in the hospital room, the difference between somebody who had a U.S. citizen mother or U.S. citizen father. If the mother didn't necessarily have the documentation, they have to come up with a DNA sample or something from the father to avoid the INS from moving in. But anyway, that just sort of
Yeah.
popped into my mind that
Yeah.
there are all further complications that. But I was just thinking about Wade's point both earlier about how this issue presents some people with an ability to pretend or to believe, perhaps really, that they're not actually engaged in modifying or interested in modifying our Constitution because of a racist orientation or because of an anti-immigrant orientation, but really because they want to address our immigration problem. But I was thinking about whether, again, back to Wade's other point about how much we can push back. I mean, how much can we make the connection in a more overt way? And I was just thinking about, so there's the Tea Party Patriots is apparently interested in organizing teaching the Constitution in the schools. It was a very scary idea, right? So they're
imagine?
looking to this so-called constitutional scholar from Texas, whose name I can't recall, but he was in the New York Times the other day, believes that the Constitution was divinely inspired. And apparently believes that the Anglo-Saxons are one of the lost tribes of Israel and therefore have some kind of a higher status in the American Constitution as a result. And so there's this, they're obviously the Tea Party Patriots, if they're looking to this scholar to guide them in teaching the Constitution in the schools, it sort of connects to me the really sort of racist implications. This is a kind of a white supremacist view of the Constitution. This seems to me to tie very closely. And how much can we take a Vitter or a Rand Paul and these guys and tie them into that? Because it seems to me that if we want to go to these people pretending,
Yeah.
really maybe believing
Yeah.
that this is about a public policy issue, about improving our immigration system, we really
Right.
need to go to the heart of where this is coming from and what the appeal is. It may be nuanced the way they're doing it in Congress, more subtle, but this is what's behind it.
Well, I think that Sam coined the phrase or gave the phrase here, dog whistle politics, dog whistle issues and race, and I think that's a great description for what's happening. Look, I remind you that at the start of the 112th Congress, members of the House purported to read the Constitution on the floor, except on issues that touched on race and slavery and all the other problems that were inherent in the original Constitution when it was framed. Okay, I understand. I know hypocrisy when I see it. There's a little expression, I know the difference between poop and pound cake. This ain't pound cake. Okay, so the bottom line is, yeah, I got it. I hear you. Let's turn that around. And I think you can be aggressive.
I think that as someone who studies race, the real problem is people's fear to recognize race when it is talked about in polite company. And one of the reasons that I gravitated toward this is that when you arm people with information and they can understand both the fallacy and the lack of logic behind and the impracticality of it, it makes it easier for average citizens to say when they hear a Vitter or whoever talk about birthright, to ask them the question, are you being racist? And I think we don't use shame enough in our politics to challenge people when you know that that's what they're doing. People need to call them out on it. And that is embedded in the paper, the idea that not so much, we've talked a lot about all the horrible things that could happen. I emphasize, I don't think any of those things are going to happen. But what we need to be aware of is that when someone comes before you to talk about advocating all these horrible things, that you have enough information that you can say, well, wait a minute, what about the racial implications about this? What about the class implications of this? Are you subtly blowing a dog whistle to appeal to an element that nobody wants to claim as their own? And I think that's the power of average citizens being able to push back against these kinds. And it's not just with birthright citizenship, it's when they talk about DREAM Act or when they talk about all sorts of public policies that have racial implications in our society, but people want to be too, particularly on our side of the aisle, we want to be too polite to say, well, wait a minute, aren't you doing X, Y, and Z?
Sam, I agree with you. I mean, I think you're absolutely right about the power of a well-informed public. I think your report helps to contribute to that. On the other hand, I also think that in an issue like this, that sunshine really is an important disinfectant, that you have to really present the facts to some degree in almost non-emotional terms to really allow Americans to wrap their minds around this. Most Americans who believe in the initiatives that are being discussed here, the so-called citizenship proposals, don't see themselves as being racist. They don't see themselves as pushing values contrary to the American perspective. They honestly think that they are, in many ways, dedicated to the America that we all know and love. And yet it is by unpacking some of the information, the issues that have come up, the points that I think all of us have made, that you get people to take a second look. I think you have to sort of bifurcate our approach. On the one hand, I think we do need a public education component that responds to the basic questions that Americans have. But secondly, I think you have to organize a political initiative that hits people where they are. On the ground, it has to be organized, and you have to make sure your own constituents are not intimidated. The beauty of the proposal that has been talked about for the other side is that they've woven this into a strategy that attacks many constituents simultaneously. The states that are looking at birthright citizenship issues are also the states that are attacking collective bargaining, are also the states that are promoting new voter ID laws, are also the states that are using new privatization initiatives to change and transform state government, and they are using the budget as the rationale for making all of these changes, when in fact, you and I all know that's nonsense. So I mean, my point is that I think we have to unpack that, we have to structure arguments that make sense, and we've got to be forceful and organized. And I think right now, there's more work to be done on our side.
All right, one last quick question. Hazine, you get the last one.
I just had a question about Hazine Ashby, Third Way, about the economic implications. You guys just said that it was not fiscally conservative. However, is there anything beyond a baby tax or mostly thinking about Social Security and how people paying into Social Security, if you have more working age people, as our country is getting older and older, you're going to need more young people. If we repeal birthright citizenship laws, if you're no longer subject to some of the rules as a citizen, would you still have to pay into Social Security? And if not, are there other taxes that you're not going to be subject to, and how will that unravel, or will it unravel our economics?
Well, it's clear, as we've said before, nobody has done any analysis of this. So we don't have the facts on that. Logically speaking, if you're not a citizen, you don't pay taxes. If you're not a citizen, you don't pay into Social Security, and therefore your whatever contribution doesn't return back to support people.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that,
I think
That
that
there's
has to.
a
Anybody who's resident in the United
no.
States.
My point is
Yeah.
that there would be no way of they're not tracking that. Anyone who's here, if they've got a job, yeah, they pay into it, but it's not a system by which we can sort of keep accounting of those kinds of costs. I mean, I think that one of the real fallacies of this whole idea is we don't know what it will do because no one has really paid any attention to it. We know about the $600, but there's
Well, and we also know people without status earn less.
Right.
Right, because when they get status, their wages go up by 15%. We learned that when the legalization passed in 1986, and we've done analysis of what would happen if you would legalize the current undocumented population, and it would a cumulative GDP growth of $1.5 trillion over 10 years. So that's money that we're leaving on the table if we add to the undocumented population. So it's, I've lost count of all the stupid reasons. Right?
Well, we also know demographically that one of the reasons why the U.S. is not having an aging population problem the way some countries in Europe are having is because of birthright citizenship. So if we take out, the 8% or so that Migration Policy Institute estimates, and it's actually going to be bigger than that because the Rand Paul, David Vitter bill takes away citizenship from all the long-term professors and the small business owners and the people that don't have green cards but are living here legally. Their kids all lose citizenship. So it takes out a huge chunk of the youth cohort out of the U.S. citizen part of the population. Now, those kids we might pass some kind of bill that gives them green cards, and then they might get citizenship eventually, but nobody's proposed that. And that would have to be part of some kind of comprehensive immigration reform that people don't seem to be interested in. We would have a serious imbalance, though, in our aging citizen population versus the younger citizens growing up. And there's a very serious demographic problem that we would encounter that's already been laid out by many policy people who say basically, the U.S. is going to have a crisis in the future if we don't import more young immigrants to bolster to pay into Social Security while the older folks are drawing it out.
And the hidden costs that we haven't talked about, hidden costs around health care when individuals, fear that they will be deported, they won't seek the kind of treatment and support and assistance they need. That helps to drive up costs for all of us.
Yeah, identity theft, one of the reasons identity theft is rampant right now is because of our immigration problem. There's detention costs, there's the deportation costs. We have to pay for more government agents to enforce the law, and there's just a whole bunch of enforcement stuff that we haven't.
Which ties into, again, one of the factors that is driving some of these initiatives at the state level. They're being pushed by individuals who represent private prisons, who see their interests going up when we have new laws that expand detention, particularly of the undocumented immigrant population. So, you're seeing, in terms of looking for connections, connecting the dots, some of the interests that are funding the on-the-ground campaign are interests that are tied into things like expanding the prison population because they benefit from that. This is at a time when states are dealing with the fiscal impact of their incarceration problems. Look at California. It currently has a case pending in the Supreme Court today over the treatment of its own state prisoners in violation of what is argued to be the Eighth Amendment of the Constitution, because they are confined in ways that clearly are unconstitutional in terms of cruel and unusual punishment.
I also just want to point out the irony in all this, and Sam, you mentioned this in your paper about, the push, the rhetoric that we hear about small government is the exact opposite that they're using here, right?
Yep.
In fact, what they want, if this were to go into effect, would be, I think, as you described, Big Brother in any hospital room, but even before that, any sort of private space where you might be engaging in child making. And that's something that, quite frankly, and it's an argument that we see all the time when it comes to abortion restrictions, to, LGBT restrictions. It's okay to have small government when it comes to corporations and big business, but actually we need a lot of scrutiny and Big Brother in the bedroom and in hospital rooms around your individual decision making.
All right, I think on that note, given the costs are going to be high, the moral cost exceptionally high, I want to have a round of applause for the terrific panel and the discussion. Thank you very much.